For a few years, I've wanted a nice wooden dice tray, and I've just not been able to find one, especially not for a price I'd be willing to pay, so in the end I just decided to make one myself. The first thing to do was to measure for the cuts, which is an entirely tedious process, so I won't make you watch all of it. The first thing that I did was work out how big I wanted the lid to be, which I ended up choosing about 11 centimeters, mostly because that was actually just the width of the piece that I had already. So I wanted it to be square, so it was 11 centimeters squared. I did the same for the base piece that I used later on. So the lid is made out of plywood and the base is a piece of hardboard, which I end up putting some felt on later. So I measured both of those to about 11 centimeters, which I did off camera because it's literally 2 lines. After that is measuring the sides. So the side is made out of what used to be a bed slat. So I took that, laid it on its edge, and used a ruler to mark a little over 11 centimeters down each side, so I gave myself some room for cutting if I messed up a cut, or the actual cut itself takes some material away, so you can't measure exactly because then you'll just end up with every piece too short. So I measured that down the edge of the wood, and once I'd gotten enough pieces, I knew I was right. So one of the reasons this video took me so long to make is because I had to clear a lot of space for and then build my new table saw. And this ended up being one of the most stressful parts because this is the first cut that I made with it. I have been around tools like this like all my life, so I wasn't like afraid of it, but at the same time, I'm not exactly comfortable with it. It's not something that I had done, and especially sort of like this where I'm cutting dados into a piece of wood, it felt very strange to have my fingers on top of it. I feel like I shouldn't have, but I did. One of the parts I didn't include when I was measuring up is that I measured up where the dados would be on the piece of wood. The reason I didn't include that is because I measured for 3 dados and then only ended up cutting 2 because I decided partway through that the wood was too thin for 3. It was the right choice, but I'm still not totally happy with it. It's not exactly the design I wanted to go with, but this is what we're going to end up with. So I cut 2 symmetrical dados, one on either side of the wood, one for the base and one for the top. A little bit later on, I do this off camera, I had to widen the grooves a little bit. I widened one of them too much, which was annoying, but I had to widen them a little bit because they just weren't quite wide enough for either piece of wood, but this is the basic process. The next thing to do was to cut the top and the base down to size. It was pretty simple. It was just a crosscut on each piece, but one of the issues with crosscuts is essentially making a cut straight through the grain. When you're doing that, you can end up with what's called tear out, where it essentially like tears the fibers of the wood. With plywood, it's a thin veneer over a piece of wood. The issue is when you get the tear out on that, it can tear the veneer off and just leave the underside exposed. There are ways around this, but I didn't do any of them, so I ended up with some tear out on this piece. It ended up okay. The next thing I needed to do was to glue the felt to the base, which means cutting the felt. In a shot that I didn't end up using, you can see me struggling to cut this for ages. Mostly at first just because I kept trying to do it in a really weird way. Like I tried to like put the felt on top of the wood and like cut around it, or like just draw on the felt and like try and cut it off that, and then eventually I was like, well, I'll just put the wood on top of the felt and cut around the wood, and that made a lot more sense. It still ended up being a bit hard to cut. Like the corners kept sticking, so I ended up having to rip it a bit. It didn't look too bad. And then it's just a matter of like gluing the wood to the felt. I just used normal PVA glue for that, and then I spread it around with a card I got at Gamescom from a German game store, so thanks to them. You can see that I don't put the glue all the way to the edges. I should have done, but the edges of the felt are going to be inside the dados anyway, so I don't have to worry about them pulling up. So yes, I should have glued those all the way to the edge, but I didn't, and it's probably not going to matter, so I'm not too worried about it. At this point we get to the most important part, which was cutting the mitred edges. It's not exactly complicated, but it's the part where things could go the most wrong, and spoiler alert, things do go wrong. The way I tried to do it this time was I have a miter saw, I set my miter saw to 45 degrees, and then I slide the wood in place, check that the blade will hit where I want it to, and then cut. That should give consistent 45 degree angles. One of the issues is I got consistent 45 degree angles, I think. I actually think I didn't, but what I definitely didn't do was get consistent lengths, which was entirely my fault. Because of that, the box didn't fit. Like it didn't fit together. I thought I was doing okay. I was using the top piece to measure the width that I needed, and then using a 45 degree edge to measure the angle that I needed. I'd then measure that all the way through and just make sure that I was getting about the same everywhere, and then as long as I got the 45 right, then it should be perfect. And they should all fit perfectly. And they just didn't. They just didn't at all. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that the cut takes some material off. I think possibly what I did was I measured and then cut on the line when I should have cut over the line or under the line on each cut. Well, I should have cut over the line, but what I'm saying is I shouldn't have cut on the line. And I think what I actually did was either cut over, on, or under the line on each cut differently, which meant they were not consistent widths. I should arguably have done this on my table saw, and I do end up doing it on my table saw, but I have used a miter saw more consistently, so I was more familiar with that. So I wanted to try using my miter saw, and that ended up being a really bad idea, to be honest. Once I've finished all those cuts, I do what's called a dry fit of the box, where I just slide all the pieces onto the box, and this is where I noticed that none of it works. The angles were a little bit off, which I'm not totally sure how that happened, but more importantly, each piece was a different length, so it just would not fit together, and ended up just falling apart as soon as I picked it up. So to fix the problems that I'd caused with my miter saw, I had to use my table saw. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the reason I didn't want to use my table saw is just because I wasn't used to using it, but more than that, I wasn't totally sure at the time how to get the angle I wanted. Now, I knew I could angle my blade, but with them being such small pieces, I didn't want to get my hands so close to it, but I also needed to use the crosscut guard, I think it's called, to do it, but the crosscut guard wasn't long enough to do the cut with them being such small pieces now, so I ended up having to build a crosscut sled, which wasn't like the end of the world, but it was just something I didn't want to have to do at the time. Crosscut sled basically is just two long pieces of wood on a big flat piece of wood, and you just do your cuts. You essentially make the cuts through that piece of wood, and then you can cut other pieces of wood on your new sled then. I did that, and it worked pretty well. I'm happy, I'm glad I've got one now. I didn't want to make one at the time, but I was planning on at some point, and it's done now. So then, it was just a matter of cut every single piece again. One piece was actually perfect, so I used that as my template. What I did was I used the long piece that was left over from all the other cuts, and I used that to sort of hold the other pieces in place. So I'll put the small piece that was perfect right up to the edge of the blade, then I put the long piece bracing that on the other side, and then I clamped the long piece in place, and then removed the small piece, and that means that every other piece from that point onwards will be the right length when I cut it. So I then cut every piece again. I cut the bits that were too long off, and then I also redid the other edges just to get them flatter, because I also got a much nicer cut with the table saw. So honestly, I should have just used the table saw in the first place, but again, wasn't really comfortable with it at the time. I'm more comfortable with it now. And then after that was the next dry fit, and the next one worked perfectly. And from that point on, I was pretty happy. Right now I've got a box with 4 sides, but it's supposed to have a lid, and I've got no way of putting the lid on. What I did was, the spare long piece, I ended up cutting some extra pieces out of that, and then I used the front side and one of those sides, and I cut both of them in half vertically, and used one as the bottom of the box, and one as the new handle. If you also remember how I mentioned that I shouldn't cut on the line, I should cut over or under. The reason I did this was because I knew that if I cut a line perfectly through one piece, I would end up with a gap in the box. So my plan was, I will cut 2 pieces of wood, one will be cut one way and one will be cut another, so when I flip them over I'll end up with 2 thicker sides and 2 thinner sides, and then the 2 thicker sides should be perfectly sized. And this was a really good plan, and then I didn't do it. And what I ended up doing was just cutting straight on the line every time, so I ended up with 4 pieces that are all exactly the same size, and still a gap in my box. It was a good plan, I just didn't pull it off. Next is the third most tedious step, only third because it doesn't last very long, and that was filing the dados. It just makes them smoother on the inside and helps things move. There's very little to say, it is literally just me filing a groove for ages. It wasn't particularly interesting, but it didn't take very long, so I guess it's okay. So now all the cutting's done, we're getting in pretty close to the end, and it's just time for the glue up. There's various ways of putting things together. This is the one I know. It only really works for things that are this small, but it works really well for things that are small, so that's what I did. Essentially, you use tape to hold all of your pieces together. It's a square box, although obviously it works with any shape box, this is a square one. You lie all your pieces face down on your work surface, and then you put them edge to edge, and you put tape over the edges to hold them in place, and then you can essentially roll up the box and it will hold in place. And then it's just a matter of you glue in between the edges, and when you fold up the edge, it squeezes the glue in place and then dries. And that's like it. It's really easy. It could go wrong if you're bad at putting tape on, and actually at one point in a clip I didn't use, the tape did come off. I fixed it, it's not a big deal. You can also use clamps to hold it in place. I didn't really want to use clamps just because it's such a small box. I was actually worried that, because I also don't have a lot of clamps, so I was actually worried that the pressure of the clamps would push the box apart, but I did end up using some clamps in the end just to make sure that the front was on as well as it could be, because with the front being a smaller piece, I was worried that it would like slide out of alignment. It was also a little easier to align actually because I had the base piece in. With the base piece in the dado that it was in, getting them all lined up around it actually gave them all something to grip onto as opposed to just having the edges, so that actually worked really well. It was my first time gluing up like this and it worked pretty well, and I was like really happy to see how it turned out. I did put way too much glue on the front edge for some reason. I did actually clean that up, but I had some trouble with the recording, where the recording, like, it happened consistently throughout actually. Luckily, every other time it had happened I didn't really lose anything, but in this shot, the time where the clip ends, I actually carried on going for another 5 minutes or so. Like, I wouldn't have wanted all that footage, but I kept going for another few minutes or so, like, tidying it up and everything. But my footage, like, killed itself, which was nice. So I lost all of that. So I ended up having to cut it where I did. But in that, I just tidied up some of the excess glue that I'd left on it and stuff like that. The only other issue I had really was that it's the first time I used this glue, and it was just really hard to get out. It was a very stiff bottle, and the glue did not want to come out at all. It wasn't like the end of the world, it wasn't like the hardest thing, but it took a lot more effort than I expected it to just get glue out of a bottle. Here it is after the glue up's done. I was actually really happy with this. It's not perfect. There's issues where, like, if you look at the lid, you can see the tear out that I was talking about earlier, and if you look at the edges of the box, you can see there's some gaps and stuff, but for my first attempt at making something like this, I was pretty happy with it. The lid, when I slide it in right now, is quite stiff, but I'm going to fix that in a minute anyway. And then there's that really annoying gap in the center, which I do have an idea for how to fix it, but I can't currently do it, so if I get a chance, I'll do it at some point, and then I'll talk about it more then. You know what I'm like for not talking about things I can't do. And then we get to the most tedious part, where I have to sand it. Essentially, all you do is rub the sandpaper on it for ages, and I have to do this with every single surface of the box. Now, if I was smart, I would have done it earlier. Before I'd glued it up, maybe, would have been a good time to sand it, but I didn't do that, so you get to watch me sand it now. So, you sand it first with the 60, then once you've sanded the entire box with that, you do the 120, and then once you've done the entire box with that, you do the 180, and then you're done. It gives you a nice finish, but it is incredibly boring and took me nearly 2 hours. And now we're in the final step before we're finished, which is applying like a varnish to it. Now you'll have to forgive me because I did not do a very good job filming this. Up until now I'd had some help setting up shots, and then my wife was out, so she couldn't help me set up the shot, and I thought I'd done a good job, and it turns out I really hadn't. So there's like a 5-minute long clip of me waving my hands in the air because you can't see a thing I'm doing. Essentially, all you do is get the varnish on a rag and rub it on the grain of the wood, and it comes out a completely different colour, and it looks really nice. I think it looks great. It didn't take as evenly as I'd like in some places. Some of that is probably my fault, like maybe I wasn't putting it on well enough, or maybe bits where I'd got glue on it, or something like that. I'm not totally sure, but I'm really happy with how it turned out, and this was like the last thing I had to do. And now, 24 hours later, we're finally done. This build took me in total about 4 days. Now, I could have done it a lot faster. For one thing, if I wasn't like constantly moving the camera and setting up for different shots, that would have meant it'd go a lot quicker. And for another, there was little bits where, like, if I'd had the crosscut sled, I wouldn't have used my miter saw at all, and that would have saved me multiple hours. So there's loads of little things where I could have done this quicker, and when I make another one, I will make it quicker. But for my first attempt, I'm really happy with how it turned out. You can see that the lid goes on a lot nicer now after the sanding and everything, and like the gaps are really annoying, but overall I still think it looks really nice. I think the varnish took really well. There's like a couple of patches where I said that it's not great, especially on the underneath. I wasn't actually planning on putting any varnish on the underneath, but when I was getting the edges on that, it just kind of brushed on it, and at that point it made more sense to just go over it as much as I could anyway, but it didn't take very well there at all. But yeah, now I've got a really nice dice tray for all of my dice needs. I don't really play Dungeons & Dragons, but you could use it for that, or use it for Warhammer and just count all your hits. use it for any other dice-based games. It's just quite nice. I also use it just for storing my dice. I've learned a lot doing this, but I think the most important takeaway that I've got from making this entire thing is don't cut MDF inside. Special thanks to my patrons, Justin Wood, Hobbs and Koopy Vegeta. You can join my patrons at patreon.com/Holden Gatsby, check out my TikTok and Twitter at Holden Gatsby, and follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Holden Gatsby. Don't forget to subscribe to all of my channels. If you want more, you can watch my last video now, but if not, then thanks for sticking around. Bye.